And Sterling thought he was divorcing a quiet, useless wife. He shoved the papers across the table, called Amelia a guest in her own home, and offered her $1 million to disappear. But there was one thing he never understood, the company he bragged about, the technology investors worshipped, the empire that made him powerful. It all came from her secret algorithm. Every line of code he claimed as his own belonged to the woman he had just humiliated. And when Amelia asked for 48 hours, she wasn't asking for time to cry. She was preparing to take everything back.
Julian Sterling grabbed his wife's arm, pulling her close as he thrust a stack of papers against her. "Sign them!" he hissed, his voice low and sharp. "You're a guest here, Amelia. You've always been a guest." Behind him, his mother Eleanor sipped her mimosa, a picture of smug satisfaction. At the base of the grand staircase stood Chloe, barely 25 and 14 weeks pregnant, fiddling with Amelia's anniversary bracelet, and Julian, the tech mogul who built his empire on his wife's secret algorithm, had no clue the woman he was dismissing owned every line of code he'd ever called his. If you're new to the channel, you picked a good day. Make sure you subscribe, ring that notification bell, and stick with us for this wild ride. And tell me your city in the comments. I'm curious to see how far this story of betrayal goes. Amelia Vance had spent 7 years learning to be invisible, not from weakness, not from a lack of intellect or a desire to fight back. She made herself small the way a volcano stays dormant, quietly building immense pressure underground until the day it erupts and completely reshapes the landscape. But on that Wednesday afternoon in October, as the San Francisco fog rolled past the penthouse windows, Amelia stood on the brink of everything she'd quietly endured, and she didn't even blink. Julian had summoned her to the dining room. That alone was a blaring alarm. Julian never summoned her for anything. For 7 years, he'd taken his meals in his high-tech home office, surrounded by glowing monitors, and the kind of arrogance that comes from a man who actually believes his own press releases. But that afternoon, he sat at the head of the long glass table, wearing a crisp suit, his expression carefully arranged to look like a man of principle. And next to him, to Amelia's left, was Eleanor Sterling, Julian's mother, a woman who treated cruelty like a competitive sport. Amelia entered the room in a simple silk top and dark trousers, her hair tied back, her expression unreadable. She saw the legal documents on the table instantly. She saw the muscle twitching in Julian's jaw as she looked at them, and she saw the faintest smirk on Eleanor's lips, like someone savouring a victory she had waited a very time to enjoy. "Sit down, Amelia," Julian ordered. She sat. "My lawyers drew these up," he said, sliding the stack towards her. "Divorce papers. I want this handled by Friday." Amelia didn't gasp. She didn't clutch her heart or cover her mouth like some damsel in distress from an old movie. She glanced at the papers. She looked right at him, and she asked, very softly, "Why?" Julian leaned back, a man who had clearly rehearsed his lines. "Because this partnership has run its course. Because I need more than this. Because, as Amelia, deep down, you have to know that you and I were never truly partners." Eleanor made a quiet sound, somewhere between a sigh and a purr that managed to be both at once. "Never partners," Amelia repeated, her voice flat. "You've been a wonderful hostess," Julian said, and the way he spat the word hostess held a special kind of poison. "You managed the house. You came to the parties. You smiled for the cameras. But you never contributed anything of value. You never built anything. You never brought a single thing to this family that couldn't be easily replaced." Amelia stared at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her eyes. Not sadness, not fury, but something far more calculated and dangerous. "Is there someone else?" she asked. The silence before he answered was just a fraction of a second too long. "That's irrelevant," Julian finally said. "Her name is Chloe," Eleanor cut in, placing her glass down with a delicate, triumphant click. "She's 25. She's ambitious. She's carrying Julian's son, and she is precisely what this family needs to secure its legacy. Not a woman who has spent 7 years doing nothing but living off my son's genius." The words were meant to be blows. Amelia felt their impact. She was human, after all, but she refused to be knocked down by them. She took one slow, steady breath and looked at Eleanor Sterling with a clarity that comes from no longer being shocked by another's malice. "Pregnant," Amelia stated. 14 weeks, Eleanor confirmed with a thin smile. "So you understand, Amelia, we need this resolved. The Sterling name must be protected." Amelia's gaze drifted back to the papers. She saw the pen Julian had placed next to them. She saw the settlement amount on the first page. He was offering her $1 million for 7 years of her life. $1 million and a strict non-disclosure agreement to just disappear. A bitter laugh almost escaped her. Almost. She pressed her lips together and met Julian's eyes with a look he would later replay in his mind 1,000 times, trying to understand it. "You're not going to fight this?" he asked. There was a strange hint of disappointment in his voice, as if he'd prepared for a dramatic scene and felt cheated out of his victory. "No," she said. "You're not even asking for more?" "No." Eleanor leaned in. "You should be aware, Julian's legal team is ruthless." "If you contest, I said no," Amelia repeated, and her voice was so calm, so utterly free of any tremor, that it silenced Eleanor instantly. Amelia put the pen down. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at her husband, her soon-to-be ex-husband, and said, "I'll sign the papers, but not today. I need 48 hours. "Amelia, 48 hours, she repeated. "I will sign them. I will take your $1 million, and I will walk out of this penthouse, and you will never have to see my face again. But you will give me 2 days." Julian glanced at his mother, who gave a nearly imperceptible shrug. "Fine," he agreed. 2 days. Amelia stood, pushed in her chair, and left the dining room without saying another word. Behind her, she could hear Eleanor already starting to gloat about how easily it was all handled. Amelia didn't hesitate. She crossed the wide, sterile hallway, climbed the floating glass staircase, and went into the bedroom that had been her cage for 7 years. She shut the door, and then, sitting on the edge of the bed, she gave herself exactly 5 minutes to feel everything she had suppressed downstairs. The grief was sharp. Not for Julian, though. She had grieved the man she thought he was months ago. The day she found the encrypted transaction for a diamond bracelet she never received. She had mourned the marriage in secret moments between charity galas and investor meetings, all while wearing a smile that cost her more than the entire Sterling fortune. The grief she felt now was for the woman who had once believed this life was worth the price of her own voice. That's what she mourned. Not the man, not the penthouse, not the jewellery that had always felt more like hush money than a gift. 5 minutes. She gave herself exactly 5 minutes. Then she picked up a secure satellite phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 7 years. It answered on the very first ring. "Miss Vance," said a calm, professional voice on the other end, a voice that held the deep respect she hadn't heard since her father was alive. "I was wondering when you might be calling." "Marcus," she said. Marcus Thorne had been her father's most trusted advisor at Vance Industries for 30 years. He had served her father for 23 of them, and had been quietly serving Amelia for the last 7. Even when her only instruction was to stay silent and ensure the Vance name never surfaced anywhere near Julian Sterling's business. He was 72, operated with the precision of a surgeon, and his only visible emotion was a slight twitch of an eyebrow that meant either excellent or catastrophic. "Are you safe?" he asked. "I will be," Amelia replied. "I need you to call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning." "Of course." There was a brief pause. "Should I prepare the main boardroom?" Amelia pictured it. She remembered the last time she'd been in that room. She remembered her father looking at her across the long, polished table and telling her, with absolute certainty, that she had the sharpest strategic mind he'd ever encountered, that his entire legacy was hers, and that her only duty was to protect it. She was 24. She had promised him, and she meant it. "Yes," she told Marcus, "prepare the main boardroom." She ended the call. Then she opened a secure file on her laptop and reviewed the final draft she'd been monitoring for weeks. The takeover documents from Vance Industries finalizing the acquisition of Sterling Innovations, the one deal Julian had no idea was happening. It was an email, an internal audit from Moreau Enterprises analyzing the $1.2 billion acquisition of Croft Design Group. The value was based on a portfolio Julian claimed his team developed over 4 years. Isabella read through the report one more time, slowly, carefully. The way you read something when you absolutely cannot afford to be wrong. When certainty is everything, she hadn't missed a thing. She set down her phone and began to pack. She was calm, methodical. She didn't take the diamonds, only a small silver locket that belonged to her grandmother. She didn't take the art or the curated objects she had spent 7 years placing in every room of this house, making it a perfect stage for a man who never noticed the details. She took her clothes, her personal papers, 3 boxes of books, and a slim portfolio case that held her real identity. Papers that had nothing to do with Julian Croft and everything to do with who Isabella Moreau really was. It took her the rest of the day. By dusk, her bags were stacked by the front door. She called a car service. She texted the manager of the downtown apartment she secretly owned. The apartment Julian didn't know existed, purchased through a shell company that traced back to Moreau Enterprises and confirmed the unit was ready. Then she walked back downstairs for their final dinner. She ate with Julian and his mother, Eleanor, as though nothing at all was wrong. She passed the bread. She answered Eleanor's questions about an upcoming gala. She watched Julian eat, never once meeting her eyes, and she memorized his comfort, his ease, his total ignorance that he was sitting with a woman who was already 5 moves ahead of him. And she kept her face a perfect, placid mask. After dinner, Julian went to his study to make a phone call. Isabella heard his quiet laughter as she helped clear the plates. She knew exactly whose voice was on the other end. She didn't need confirmation. Eleanor found her in the kitchen. "I want you to know," Eleanor said, her voice low with false sincerity, "that this isn't personal. It's about legacy. Julian needs a woman who can build with him. You were always lovely, Isabella, but you never had the ambition this family requires." Isabella dried her hands on a linen towel. She looked at Eleanor Croft, this woman who spent 7 years finding new ways to make her feel like an outsider in her own marriage, and she felt a sense of finality settle over her, clear and cold. "Thank you for dinner, Eleanor," she said. Eleanor blinked. That wasn't the reaction she wanted. She'd been hoping for tears, for anger, for some sign of the wounded pride she had worked so hard to provoke. She had not expected 2 simple words and a polite smile. Eleanor sputtered. "Good night," Isabella said. She went upstairs, confirmed her car for the morning, and went to sleep. She slept soundly. The next morning, Isabella was up before 6. She showered, dressed, and brought her bags down to the main hall. When the car arrived at 7, she loaded her things herself, declining the driver's offer to help. Not to prove a point, but because she was simply focused and had no time to waste. Julian came downstairs at 7:15 in a robe, hair uncombed, and froze at the bottom of the stairs when he saw the luggage. "You're leaving?" he said, sounding genuinely shocked. "I told you I needed a couple of days." Isabella said, "Today's the 2nd day. As for the papers, I'll sign them this afternoon. Have your lawyer email the final version." Julian stared at her. Something on his face shifted from his usual arrogance to something that almost looked like fear. "Just like that," he said. "Just like that," Isabella confirmed. "Isabella." He said her name differently this time, softer, less like a statement and more like a question. Are you going to be okay?" She looked at him. 7 years of a face she once loved. 7 years of a man who took everything she gave him and called it nothing. "Better than okay," she said, and she picked up her final bag and walked out the front door. Marcus was waiting at Moreau Enterprises at 9 a.m. sharp. He met her in the lobby with the calm efficiency of a man who had expected this moment and planned for it. He led her to the executive elevator, using his key card for the 40th floor, and stood beside her in silence as they ascended. "The board has been notified of an emergency session this morning," he said. I told them only that it was called by a senior partner within the holding company. Good, Isabella said. Several members of the acquisitions team are under the impression. Today's meeting is to fast-track the Croft design discussions. Even better. Marcus looked at her with a faint expression of approval she had known since she was a girl. It's very good to have you back, Miss Moreau. Isabella straightened her jacket as the elevator doors opened onto the 40th floor. She stepped out into the wide corridor and the low hum of serious money at work. Let's get started, she said. The boardroom was a long expanse of glass, with a view of the city spread out below like a map of her own territory. 12 people were seated at the table when Isabella walked in. She knew all of their faces. Several of them knew hers, though not in the context she was now appearing. 2 of them, the men leading acquisitions who'd been working with Julian's team, had never met her. They had no idea what was about to happen. Isabella walked to the head of the table. She set down her portfolio. She did not smile. She did not offer greetings. She simply took control of the room. My name is Isabella Moreau, she said. I am the sole heir and acting CEO of Moreau Enterprises. I've been absent from active management for 7 years for personal reasons. That absence ends today. The silence in the room was absolute. Then one of the acquisitions men, a man named David with a flushed, confused face, cleared his throat. I'm sorry, he said, but I was under the impression that this meeting was regarding the Croft Design Group acquisition. It is, Isabella said. She opened her portfolio. She placed a set of documents before her. Then she looked at David with an expression so calm it was chilling. Tell me, she said, how much do you really know about the origin of the designs in the Croft design portfolio? David looked to his colleague, then back at Isabella. They're Mr. Croft's concepts, developed over a 4-year period. They represent no, Isabella said, her voice cutting through the air. They don't. And she began. She explained it all with the cold precision that comes from years of quiet preparation. She had not been asleep during her marriage. While Julian had been building a name on designs from her private architectural studies, from sketchbooks she'd filled long before she met him, she had been watching, documenting, and preparing for this day. Every single design in the Croft portfolio that made the company worth $1 billion, every one of them had its origin in work that was legally and documentably hers. By the time Isabella finished speaking, David had stopped looking confused and started looking physically ill. The rest of the table was frozen, witnessing something they knew would change everything. Marcus, standing at her side, placed a final document in front of her. She signed her name at the bottom. She pushed the stack to the centre of the table. The acquisition of Croft Design Group is cancelled, she said, effective today. Furthermore, our legal team will be filing suit for intellectual property theft and fraud. She paused. Are there any questions? There were no questions. Isabella closed her portfolio. She looked out at the city below the glass wall of the boardroom. Somewhere out there, Julian Croft was in his office, surrounded by his blueprints and his confidence, certain he had outsmarted her. He had no idea. He had built his empire on her foundations. He had mortgaged her silence and called it his talent. He had offered her pocket change and the word housewife, as if either of those things could ever contain who she was. Isabella looked at her reflection in the glass for just a moment. She was home. She eyed the vast, indifferent city spread out below her. Then she turned back to the room. Time to get to work, she said. From the 38th floor, the city was an entirely different beast. Charlotte had forgotten that. Forgotten how it felt to be so high above it all that the noise just stops, that the chaos below becomes a thing you watch, not a thing you have to survive. She stood by the window of her own office, hers, not her father S., even though it had been his for 20 years. She gave herself exactly 1 minute of silence before the day rushed in. Arthur entered without knocking, which was his ways, a habit Charlotte had always respected. Gerald Patterson is asking for a follow-up, Arthur said, placing a leather folder on her desk. He wants to talk about the acquisition cancellation timeline. He's asking if there's any wiggle room. There isn't, Charlotte replied, her back still to him. I already told him that. What was his response? He said, and I'm quoting here, that he'd built a strong working relationship with Mr. Prescott's team, and it would be a shame to dismantle it. Arthur paused. He also hinted that he wasn't sure if your authority on this was, as he put it, fully established. Charlotte finally turned from the window. He questioned my authority? He did. She stared at us for a second, book him for 2 o'clock in the boardroom, and pull his personnel file. A flicker of satisfaction crossed Arthur's face. Already done, he said, and then he left. Charlotte sat at the desk. The leather felt cold. The chair a little too big for her, which meant no one had adjusted it since her father last sat there. It was the kind of detail that could undo you if you let it. She wouldn't. She opened the folder Arthur left and started reading. The first file was a complete financial history of Prescott architecture over the last 4 years. Charlotte had ordered it 3 days ago from a forensic accounting firm on retainer through Wellington Holdings' legal division. It was one of the many quiet parts of the company that kept running in the background of her marriage, like a clock she'd wound up and just let tick. Her pen moved as she read, marking up the pages. The numbers told a story. They always did if you knew how to read them. Prescott Architecture had gone from a small firm to a national name almost overnight. That transformation lined up perfectly with a project Ethan presented in Chicago. 4 years ago, the Aldrin Center design, a tower so original it won 2 industry awards. That design had landed Prescott Architecture on the cover of 3 magazines. Charlotte remembered being in that audience in Chicago. She was in the 3rd row, watching her husband at a podium, describing a design philosophy she herself had developed in a sketchbook 2 years into their marriage. It was during the 6 weeks she was home alone while Ethan was supposedly on a business trip in Europe, a trip she later found out was something else entirely. She didn't say a word. Not then. She just watched the crowd applaud her husband for her ideas, sat perfectly still, and decided to wait. Not out of fear or doubt. She just understood that the right moment isn't always the first one, and a woman who moves too soon hands her advantage right back to her enemy. She had waited 4 years. The moment had finally come. By 11 a.m., her phone had rung 6 times. 4 of those calls were from unknown numbers, which meant the news was spreading through the usual channels. The world of acquisitions, of architecture, that specific layer of society where Ethan Prescott built his name, and where the name Wellington carried a weight men like Ethan spent their whole lives trying to achieve. She sent those calls to voicemail. The 5th was her lawyer, Diana Marsh, her counsel for 9 years, and one of only 3 people who knew the full scope of what Charlotte was planning. I heard, Diana said, word travels fast. It does. Gerald Patterson is already making calls. He spuked. He should be. Charlotte. Diana's voice changed, shifting from professional to cautious. Ethan's lawyer has already contacted my office. They're asking if today's news affects the divorce settlement. Charlotte put her pen down. What did they say exactly? They said Mr. Prescott is aware of certain claims being made about the intellectual property in his firm's portfolio, and he considers those claims baseless. They also said, and I'm reading this verbatim, that if Miss Wellington intends to use these claims as leverage in the divorce, they will contest the entire thing on grounds of bad faith negotiation. The silence on Charlotte's end of the line was exactly 4 seconds long. Bad faith, she repeated. That's the term they used. He shoved me into a wall this morning, Diana. Another silence, this time from Diana's end. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder. Did anyone see it? His mother was in the doorway. She's not going to testify against her son. No, Charlotte agreed. She's not. She picked her pen back up. But the security camera in the front hall of the estate might have a different story to tell. Diana was quiet for a beat. Please tell me you can get that footage. The state's security system was installed by a company that Wellington Holdings happens to have a stake in, Charlotte said. And I've always been listed as an authorized user on the account. The sound Diana made was half laugh, half sharp breath. You've been planning this for a while, haven't you? I've been prepared, Charlotte corrected. There is a difference. She got up and walked back to the window. File a counterclaim, physical intimidation and coercion, for starters. Attach the request for the footage. I want it filed by the end of business today. Done. Charlotte, he's going to come at you with everything he has when he figures this out. I know. Are you ready? Charlotte gazed out at the city. Somewhere down there, in an office on the 31st floor, just 3 blocks away. Her husband was likely sitting at his desk, feeling confident, completely unaware that the foundation of his entire career had just been ripped out from under him. Ripped out by the woman he'd pushed against a wall that morning and offered $200,000 to just go away. I've been ready for 4 years, she said. She hung up the phone. It was 11:23. She had 37 minutes until her next meeting. She picked up her desk phone and dialed the head of her communications division, Marcus Webb. Marcus, she said. I need a press strategy by the end of the week. Not loud. Precise. I want our version of the story told correctly from the start. I want to control the narrative before anyone else tries to frame it for me. Understood, Marcus said. Can you give me the basic outline? Charlotte considered how to distill 7 years of betrayal, $40 billion, and a man's hand on her wrist into a talking point for a PR executive. A company, she began, was nearly acquired based on fraudulent claims. That fraud has been uncovered, and the deal is off. The person behind the fraud is the same man whose divorce from a Wellington Holdings executive is being finalised. We need the public to know the Wellington name is secure, the company is secure, and the person who tried to exploit this company for his own gain is being held accountable. She paused. Lead with the company's integrity, not the personal drama. The personal details will find their own way out. And the executive you mentioned? Marcus asked carefully. How should we refer to her? As Charlotte Wellington, she said, CEO of Wellington Holdings. That is all. She hung up. She stood at the window, and for just 1 second she let herself feel it, the deep loneliness of a woman who had to orchestrate her own justice in silence over years, because no one else was there when the damage was first done. No one saw Ethan steal her ideas and pass them off as his, and no one saw his mother, Victoria, spend 7 years trying to dismantle Charlotte's very sense of self. Nobody ever saw what her marriage had cost, not in the big, dramatic moments, but in the 1,000 tiny cuts of being told, day after day, that she wasn't quite enough. She felt it all land, just for a moment, just for one deep breath. Then she turned from the skyline and got back to her life. Marcus Thorne's Pitcairn arrived at 2 o'clock, looking like a man who'd spent the last few hours rehearsing a speech he no longer believed it in. He'd brought along a junior analyst, some kid named Leo that Eleanor recognized from the M&A team, and he wore the pained expression of a man trying to project confidence when he knew, deep down, that confidence was the last thing he had. David showed them into the main conference room. Eleanor was already at the head of the table, the due diligence report for the Croft acquisition glowing on her tablet. She didn't get up when they walked in. Marcus, she said, thanks for making the time. He sat down with the forced casualness of a man trying to claim his territory. Eleanor, he started. The way his voice caught, just for a second, before saying her name, told her exactly how the rest of this meeting was going to play out. I just want to start by saying I'm incredibly excited about the synergies this deal represents for Vance Innovations. How long has your team been reviewing the source code for Project Chimera? Eleanor asked, cutting him off. Marcus blinked. 6 months, give or take. And in those 6 months, did anyone on your team run a deep-level plagiarism check against open-source libraries? A beat of silence. We were operating on the assumption that yes or no, Marcus. No, he finally said. Did anyone question why the core algorithm was so poorly documented? Almost like it had been dropped in from somewhere else. Did anyone, Eleanor repeated, her voice dangerously calm, in 6 entire months, bother to ask where this code actually came from? The silence in the room felt heavy enough to break the table. No, Marcus admitted. Eleanor swiped a finger across her tablet, and an email chain appeared on the big screen. In August, you received a request from Julian Croft's legal team to fast-track the code review, citing proprietary methods. Your team agreed. She looked straight at Marcus. Why? His face was starting to lose its colour. The deal had a very aggressive timeline. And let me be more specific, Eleanor said. You agreed because Mr. Croft suggested he had a board member in his pocket, a friend who could kill the entire acquisition if you created any delays. Is that about right? The junior analyst, Leo, looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. Marcus stared at Eleanor. That's a pretty serious accusation. It's a question, Eleanor said, and I have the server logs. This time, the silence stretched on, becoming an answer all by itself. Eleanor stood up. I'm not firing you today, Marcus. I'm giving you a chance. I want a full unredacted report detailing every corner your team cut, every pressure campaign, every single red flag you ignored. It will be on my desk by 9 a.m. tomorrow. If it's the whole truth, we can discuss your future here. If it's not, or if I find one thing missing, this conversation continues with our General Counsel. She picked up her tablet. Do I make myself clear? Marcus just nodded. Say it, please, I understand, he choked out. Eleanor walked to the door, then paused. She glanced back at him. And Marcus, the next time you're not sure who runs this company, remember this meeting. She left. David, her executive assistant, was waiting with her schedule and a hot green tea. She took it without breaking stride. How did it go? He asked, falling in step beside her. He'll sing, she said. He's more afraid of the digital paper trail than he is of me, which tells me he knows exactly what's buried in it. She took a sip of tea. What's next on the agenda? You have a 3 p.m. call with the legal team about the Croft lawsuit. At 4, the signed separation agreement is due back to Julian's attorney. And at 4:30, David hesitated for a second, which was so unlike him it immediately got Eleanor's full attention. At 4:30, a letter arrived by courier. I placed it on your desk. The return address is the Croft family estate in Lake Forest. Isabella, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. The handwriting on the envelope is a match for her signature from the Foundation's charity gala files. David kept his face, a perfect mask of neutrality. I did not open it. Eleanor started walking again, faster this time. She went straight into her office, set down her tea, and picked up the thick linen envelope from her desk. It was the kind of stationery that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. She tore it open. Inside was a single, handwritten card in Isabella Croft's elegant, sharp-edged script. It read, Eleanor, you believe you have won a battle today. You have only started a war with a family whose influence you can't possibly comprehend. Julian's network extends far beyond software, far beyond Chicago. You have no idea what you are unleashing. Think very carefully about whether you want to see this through to the end. Some doors, once opened, can never be shut again. I am offering you this one chance as a courtesy, because I have never taken you for a fool. Do not prove me wrong. Eleanor read it through twice. She placed it carefully on her desk. She stared at it. Then she picked up her phone and called Chloe. I need to add a new filing to our complaint, she said the moment Chloe answered. What is it? Attempted intimidation of a litigant. I just received a lovely little note from Isabella Croft. I'll have David scan it and send it over right now. Eleanor, Chloe's voice went tight. That letter means they're running scared. I know, scared people do stupid, dangerous things. I know that too, Eleanor said. Which is why we're going to move faster. She paused. What's the absolute soonest we can file the IP theft suit? With everything ready to go, maybe the end of the week. Make it tomorrow morning. Before Marcus Thorne delivers his confession, he picked up the card again, holding it by the very edge, like it was a piece of contaminated evidence. I want Julian to get served with the lawsuit before he ever hears from Marcus. I want him to realize these aren't two separate fires. They're one single inferno, and I'm the one who lit the match. Chloe was quiet for a beat. When she finally spoke, her voice was laced with something that sounded a lot like respect. "You're not pulling any punches, are you?" "He grabbed my arm in our kitchen this morning," Eleanor said, her voice flat. "And that was the absolute last time anyone from that family ever puts their hands on anything that belongs to me." She ended the call. For the next 45 minutes, she walked the legal team through the IP theft case with a clarity that stunned a room full of people paid to be unflappable. She knew every line of code. She knew every falsified timestamp. She knew precisely which of Julian's claims were lies and which pieces of evidence would make him look like a thief in front of a judge. She had been building this case for 2 years, piece by piece, on an encrypted drive, in the dead of night while Julian slept, carving out a secret life he never even suspected she was capable of having. At 3:58, she sent an email to her personal account. The subject line was simple: delivered. Attached was a scanned copy of their signed separation agreement. She had done it, signed by 4 p.m. She'd even taken the settlement money he'd offered. She had done everything she said she would. What she hadn't told him about was everything else. At 4:47, her assistant, Nina, a sharp young woman with zero connection to the Chicago old money scene, buzzed the intercom. "Miss Vance," Nina said, "there's a visitor for you in the lobby." Eleanor looked up. "Who is it?" Nina sounded hesitant, which was a first. "He says his name is Julian Croft. He has no appointment. Security is with him. He says it's an emergency. He's demanding to see you." Eleanor let a small, cold smile touch her lips. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for 2 full seconds. Then she said, "Tell security to let him up. Conference room 3, and not my office." Nina signed off. David appeared in the doorway almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting right outside. "Which he had been. Is that wise?" he asked. "Probably not," Eleanor said, standing and smoothing her dress. "But I really want to see the look on his face." "Come with me." Julian Croft looked like a man who had woken up confident his world was perfectly in order, only to spend the afternoon watching it burn to the ground. He was pacing in conference room 3, still wearing the expensive suit he'd likely worn to a victory lunch with his lawyer. But the victory was gone. Now he just looked like a man who had finally realized he was no longer in control. "Eleanor," he said, his voice raw. She sat across the polished table from him. Marcus stood by the door. Ava didn't invite Liam to sit. "You killed the acquisition," Liam said. "I did." "You can't." He stopped, regrouping. "This is because we're getting divorced." "This," Ava said, "is because you submitted fraudulent IP claims to a venture firm you didn't know I owned, trying to secure a valuation based on work you stole directly from me." Liam's jaw tightened. "My team developed that algorithm. The Helios project," Ava said, "was first documented in a white paper I can produce, dated, with digital signatures from March of 6 years ago, 14 months before your startup even had a name." She looked at him steadily. "Would you like to continue this argument?" He said nothing. "You built your company on my code," she said. "You built your reputation on my ideas. You stood on stages and accepted awards for software that came from my mind, in my private repositories, on servers that were running in this building before I ever met you." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't waver. It just continued, precise and clear and crushing in its accuracy. "And then you slid divorce papers across our kitchen table and told me I had never contributed anything of value." Liam's face twisted. She watched him try to find his usual arrogance and saw it slip away from him in real time. "I didn't know," he began, "about the Sterling Group. I had no idea you were—" "I know you didn't know," Ava said. "That was my choice. I protected your company for 7 years because I thought that was the same as protecting us. I was wrong." She stood up. "The lawsuit will be filed Thursday morning. I'd recommend you speak to your attorney tonight." "Ava," his voice broke on her name. "Just slightly. Just enough. What we had We had years together. We had you telling me I was nothing, she said, and we had me knowing you were wrong and saying nothing at all. She walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. I think we both know which one of us understood the reality of our situation. She left him there. She walked back down the corridor and into her office, and she closed the door. And she stood alone in the room that had been her father's and was now hers. And she pressed both hands flat on the surface of the desk, and she breathed. Because here was the thing that no one tells you about being right, about being the person who saw it coming, who prepared, who moved at exactly the right moment. It does not stop hurting. It does not take the weight of 7 years off your chest in a single afternoon. You can be right and winning and utterly in control of every piece on the board and still feel, in the quiet of a room with the door closed, the particular grief of a woman who loved someone who never deserved it. She felt it. She let herself feel all of it. Then she straightened her shoulders. She sat down. She opened the next folder. There was still so much work to do. The lawsuit hit Liam Vance's inbox at 8:57 Thursday morning, 3 minutes before David Chen's written report was due to land on Ava's. She knew the exact moment it arrived because her lawyer, Helen, called her while she was in the car on her way into the Sterling Group. And Helen's voice had the particular quality of controlled satisfaction that Ava had learned to recognize over 9 years of working together. "It's filed," Helen said. "The full complaint, IP theft, fraudulent misrepresentation, and we attach the provenance documentation on all 11 modules. The Helios algorithm, the Nexus platform, the Sentinel security suite. Everything." A pause. "Ava, the documentation is ironclad. I've been doing this for 23 years, and I have never seen a case this clean." "He thought I wasn't paying attention," Ava said. "He thought you were a venture capitalist's wife," Helen said, and the word landed between them with all the irony it deserved. Ava looked out the window at the city moving past her. "What happens now?" "His attorney will request an emergency hearing to dispute the filing. They'll argue that the code was developed collaboratively during the marriage and that any intellectual contribution you made is subject to marital property law, not independent IP ownership." Helen's voice sharpened. "But the server logs predate the marriage by 14 months on 3 of the core patents. That argument falls apart the moment a judge looks at the dates. And the other 8 modules? Those are trickier, developed during the marriage. But we have your private code repositories, your personal emails, your private digital files with metadata timestamps, and 2 witnesses who can testify to seeing you working on those concepts independently." Helen paused again. "One of those witnesses is Marcus Hale." Ava felt something warm move through her chest at that. Marcus, who had known her since she was a girl running through the Sterling Group corridors in her school uniform. Marcus, who had kept her secrets for 7 years without once asking her to explain them. "He agreed. He called me himself," Helen said. "Yesterday afternoon," he said, and I'm reading his exact words because I wrote them down, that he had been waiting for the appropriate moment to be useful, and that this appeared to be it. Ava pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry in the back of a car at 8:58 in the morning. She was absolutely not going to do that. "Tell him thank you," she said. "Tell him yourself," Helen said. "He's already at the office." She was right. Marcus was standing in the lobby of the Sterling Group when Ava walked in, holding her morning schedule and a cup of black coffee exactly the way he always did. And he looked at her with that faint expression of approval that had anchored her childhood and was anchoring her now. "Good morning, Miss Sterling," he said. "Marcus," she took the coffee. She looked at him for just a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Thank you." "For what?" he said, and walked with her to the elevator. David Chen's written account arrived at 9:04, 7 minutes later than promised, which Ava noted and filed away. It was 42 pages long, which was either the sign of a thorough confession or a carefully constructed justification. and she spent the first hour of her morning reading every word of it with her pen moving steadily across the margins. It was, as it turned out, both. He had included dates, communications, meeting notes, and a remarkably detailed account of the agreement. It confirmed exactly what Ava had suspected, that Liam's attorney had applied indirect pressure through a series of implication-laden conversations that never explicitly said anything improper, but made the desired outcome clear enough that no one in the room had needed it spelled out. It was the kind of corruption that was nearly impossible to prosecute on its own terms because it lived in the space between words, in the inflection of a suggestion and the knowing silence that followed. But David, whether out of genuine remorse or simple self-preservation, had been thorough, and thorough was enough. Ava forwarded the account to Helen at 10:15 with a single line. Add this to the file. Then her phone rang. The number on the screen was one she did not have saved, but the area code was local, and something about seeing it made the back of her neck prickle in a way she had learned to trust. She answered. Is this Ava Sterling? The voice was female, young and slightly unsteady, in the way of someone who has rehearsed a phone call and is now discovering that the rehearsal did not fully prepare them for the reality. It is, Ava said, a pause. Then, quieter, this is Chloe. The room did not change. The sounds of the Sterling group continued around her, the low hum of the building, the distant sound of a keyboard, the muffled exchange of voices somewhere down the corridor. None of it changed, but the quality of Ava's attention shifted in a way that was total and immediate. Chloe, she said carefully, I know I have no right to call you. I know what you must think of me. The voice was picking up speed now, the way a person talks when they are afraid that if they slow down, they will lose their nerve entirely. But there are things you don't know about Liam, about the pregnancy, about what he's been telling people, and I need you to know them. Not because it helps me. It doesn't. But because what he's doing to you is not okay, and you deserve to know the whole truth. Ava set down her pen. She leaned back in her chair. She thought about this woman, 26 years old, standing at the foot of the staircase in her house, wearing her necklace, and she thought about the particular difficulty of deciding how much space to give to the humanity of a person who had contributed to your pain. She said, talk, and what Jessica said next took 11 minutes. Charlotte listened without saying a word. Jessica explained that the pregnancy was real 3 months along, just like she'd said. But the rest of the story Victoria had spun about the Prescott family legacy and Jessica's place in it was a lie. From the inside, it was a totally different picture. Ethan had spent their entire relationship insisting his marriage to Charlotte was purely business. He claimed Charlotte knew all about them and didn't care that a divorce was already in motion. He sold her that story so well that Jessica built her entire future around it, believing she was stepping into a marriage that was already over. Then, 2 days ago, Ethan called her, but he didn't have that calm, confident tone she was used to. Underneath it all, he sounded scared. He told her to stay silent. He said there were some business complications, and it was vital that Jessica not talk to anyone, not reporters, not lawyers, and especially not anyone connected to Charlotte Wellington. He said they wouldn't be discussing the baby publicly for a while. He never asked how I was, Jessica said, her voice cracking. He didn't ask about our baby. He just called to tell me to shut up, and then he was gone. Charlotte sat perfectly still. Jessica, she said, keeping her voice completely level, though it took effort. Is there anything else? Yes! A short breath. 3 weeks ago, I found some papers in his home office. I wasn't looking for them. I just needed a phone charger, but they were right there on his desk. I didn't get all of it, but I took pictures because it just felt wrong. The documents were about a company, Belford Capital. There were huge money transfers, moving from Prescott Architecture's accounts to some place that wasn't on the official books. Charlotte picked her pen back up. Her hand was rock steady. How large? The ones I saw were between 800,000 and 2.3 million. How many were there? Jessica snorted. The pages I saw had 7, but the paperwork mentioned a much longer series. The reference numbers started at transfer 14. Charlotte wrote it down. At least 14 known transfers. At that amount, this wasn't just IP theft anymore. It was massive fraud. This was the kind of financial crime that went beyond a simple lawsuit and straight into federal territory. "Can you send me those photos?" Charlotte asked. "That's why I'm calling," Jessica replied. Charlotte gave her a secure email that went through Wellington Holdings' encrypted server. She heard the clicks of a phone camera as the images were attached and sent. "Jessica," Charlotte said after Fran's finished, "you need to get a lawyer. Your own lawyer, not Ethan's, and nobody tied to the Prescott family." "I know," Jessica whispered. "I'm so sorry for my role in this. I know that doesn't change anything." Charlotte considered what to say. She could be gracious and accept the apology, play the part of the bigger person. Or she could be honest, and the truth was, forgiveness wasn't something she could just pull out of a hat on a Thursday morning. Not 10 minutes after learning this woman's slept with her husband in her own bed, wearing her necklace. She found a middle ground, because that's where the truth usually is. "Take care of yourself," she told her, "and take care of your baby." Then she hung up. She sat for a moment, the phone still in her hand, the sheer weight of it all sinking in. Belford Capital, 14 transfers. The number stared back at her from her notepad like a door she was about to walk through, knowing she could never close it again. Her first call was to Marcus Webb in communications. "I need you to find everything on a company called Belford Capital," she said. "Just publicly available info for now. Corporate records, who runs it, any known business ties with Prescott Architecture. I need it within the hour." "On it," Marcus said. Her next call was to Diana. "Are you sitting down?" Charlotte asked. "I'm never sitting down." Diana shot back. "What is it?" So Charlotte told her everything. About the call with Jessica, about the photos now sitting in her secure inbox, and about the numbers, the transfers, the sequence, and what it all implied. Diana was quiet for so long, Charlotte had to check if the call had dropped. "Diana, I'm here," Diana finally said. "I'm just..." Another pause. "Charlotte, if these figures are real, and this goes back as far as it seems, this isn't a civil suit anymore. We're talking financial fraud on a scale that will bring in the SEC, maybe even federal prosecutors. I know, this is much bigger than the divorce, bigger than the lawsuit over the designs. I know that too. Do you want to go straight to the authorities? Or do you want to... I want to see the photos first." Charlotte cut in. "I want our forensic accountants to verify everything before we make a move we can't take back. I'm not handing the feds a case that turns out to be half-baked." She paused. "But Diana, if this is what it looks like," Diana said quietly. "Ethan Prescott is going to prison." Charlotte put down her pen. In all her careful planning, through the months and years of building her case and waiting for the right time to strike, she had never let herself think that far ahead. She'd focused on the company, the architectural designs, on taking back what was hers. She had thought about Ethan's reputation, the Prescott family name, Victoria's condescending smile, and the smirk on Ethan's face when he'd tried to bully her with those divorce papers. She'd thought about all of it, but she had never let herself think about prison, because prison meant this was so much bigger than just a personal betrayal, and she wasn't sure she wanted to be responsible for that. But now, she was sure. "Call me once you've seen the photographs," she told Diana. She opened her email. The pictures were there. 12 images, a little blurry around the edges like photos of documents always are, but perfectly clear. She forwarded them to their forensic accounting firm with an urgent flag, then she sent them to Diana. Then she printed copies, put them in a folder, and locked it in her desk. At 12:30, Marcus Webb sent his report on Belford Capital. It was a shell company set up in Delaware 18 months prior. The principal was a man named Roy Callahan, a 43-year-old financial advisor whose name also appeared as a consultant for Prescott Architecture about 22 months ago. The company had no business operations, no website, no address other than the registration agent. It was a classic ghost corporation created for the single purpose of hiding money where a paper trail was supposed to die. Charlotte read the report twice, then placed it in the locked drawer. Just then, Priya knocked and came in. "Miss Wellington," she said, "there are 2 reporters in the lobby without an appointment. They're from the Financial Chronicle. They said they have a tip about the cancelled Prescott Architecture deal and they want a comment." Charlotte glanced at her wall clock. It was 12:47. The lawsuit was filed less than 4 hours ago. How could they know so fast? Priya wondered. Someone leaked it, Charlotte said, thinking through the possibilities. It wasn't her team. They were airtight. Not Diana. Not Arthur. That left the Prescotts. Either someone on Ethan's side panicked and ran to the press, or more likely, Victoria Prescott decided to spin the story herself and completely misread the situation. "Tell them I'm not available today," Charlotte instructed. "Tell them Wellington's Falls is releasing a formal statement by Friday, and all questions should go to our communications director," she added. "And Priya, make sure Marcus knows they're down there." Priya nodded and left. Charlotte got up and walked over to the window, the press. She knew this was coming. She'd warned Marcus to get ready for it. But the timing was off. It meant the story was already breaking out of her control, which meant the next 24 hours would define the public narrative, and that narrative would determine how much of her company could survive this mess. She called Marcus again. "The Financial Chronicle is in our lobby," she said. "I know," he replied. "They also hit my direct line 20 minutes ago, and I just got an alert from a guy at the Tribune. They've got the same tip. The source? Don't know yet, but the angle they're taking is interesting." His voice was tight. "They're framing this as a smear campaign by a jealous wife. They're using the word revenge. Isabel saw it instantly. Chloe. This was Chloe's work. The calculated spin, the victim-playing language, positioning Leo as a man trapped by a vengeful pregnant woman instead of a liar facing the music. It was clever. It was exactly the kind of story that could muddy the waters and make people doubt her. "Change the plan for the story," Isabel said. "I want it leaked to the Post by 9 tomorrow morning, not a formal statement Friday. And Ben, include the screenshots of the texts, not the bank records, not yet, just the text. Let his own words tell the story. And the pregnancy? How do we handle that?" Isabel thought for a moment. The pregnancy was her biggest weakness and her greatest strength. Used the right way, it gave the story a powerful, human core. Used the wrong way, it made everything she was doing look like hormonal revenge, which was both insulting and exactly what Chloe wanted. "The pregnancy is only mentioned as context for the depth of his betrayal," she said, "not as the reason I'm acting. I am not a scorned woman. I'm a partner whose trust was systematically destroyed. Those are the facts." "That is the story. Got it," Ben said. At 2:15, her lawyer, Nina, called back. "The private investigator verified 4 of the 12 photos," she said. "Isabel, they're real. The timestamps are accurate. The hotel receipts are real too. The charges match a credit card Leo opened last year under a shell corporation. One we found in his office files. A beat. The PI wants to see all the financial records, not just the statements you found, the original brokerage accounts, if possible." "I'll call my wealth manager," Isabel said. "There's something else," Nina said, her voice dropping to that low tone she used for bad news. "Our forensic guy recognized the name of that shell corporation. Belford Investments. He's seen it before, not with Leo, but in a divorce case he handled 8 years ago. He says that specific structure is used for one thing, illegally hiding marital assets." A pause that felt like it sucked the air out of the room. The husband, in that case, got 2 years for perjury. Isabel stood completely still. 2 years, she whispered. The circumstances were different, a lot less money involved. Leo's deception, if these documents mean what we think, is far more complex. The potential legal exposure could be much, much higher. Isabel sank into her chair. She put her hand flat on the cool wood of her desk and thought about the man she had married. Not the man she was divorces. Not the arrogant, dismissive person who had offered her $250,000 in hush money. She thought about the man she'd said yes to 8 years ago, on a day that felt like the start of everything. She thought about the man she believed him to be. "Nina," she said, "whatever happens next, I need you to promise me something. Make sure that when this is all over, the story that people tell is the true one, not the version Chloe is spinning, not the one where I'm the villain and Leo is the poor trapped husband." Her voice was like steel. The true one, where a woman spent years building a life while the man she trusted was secretly planning to burn it all down. That story, that is the one that has to survive. Nina was silent for a second. "It will," she said. "I promise you that." Isabel hung up the phone. She opened a secure folder on her laptop and looked at the files inside. The photographs, the Belford Investments report, the investigator's 20-page summary, the threatening texts from Chloe. She stared at it all, this collection of lies and proof and consequences, and she thought about how long she had carried this weight all by herself. "Not by myself," she corrected. Her sister, Nina? The circle of friends her husband had never charmed, because they had always seen something she refused to. They had known. She closed the folder. Then her assistant buzzed. "Miss Vance, I have Mr. Sterling on line 1. He says he has to speak with you urgently, he says." Maya paused, and in that small gap, Isabel heard not just professionalism, but real discomfort. "He says, if you don't talk to him right now, he's going to post a tell-all video at 4 o'clock today." Isabel glanced at the clock. 2:23. 1 hour and 37 minutes. She almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because she knew this move. This was a man who had just realized his threats were empty and was trying to knock over the whole chessboard. It was desperate. It was a panic attack. And panic attacks, in Isabel's experience, almost always wound the person having them. "Put him through," she said. She picked up the phone. "Leo," she said, "stop it." His voice was nothing like yesterday's. The smooth confidence was shattered. Underneath was something raw and ugly. "Stop the lawyers. Stop leaking things to the press. Just stop everything and I will give you whatever you want. Double the offer. Triple it. Just tell me the number." "You can't afford to triple it," Isabel said quietly. "Not anymore." A dead silence. Then, "What does that mean?" "It means the question of what you can afford is something your new criminal attorney is going to be explaining to you very soon. I suggest you listen to him instead of me." She kept her voice flat. "Post your video, Leo. Say whatever you want, but you need to understand one thing." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "Every single claim you make from now on becomes public record. Every lie can be disproven, documented, and used against you." Another beat. "Are you absolutely certain you want to be on the record?" The silence on the other end of the line was the longest one yet. "I could have been better to you," he finally said, his voice so quiet she could barely hear it. "I know that. I know I made mistakes that." "Leo," she said. "What? Don't." She hung up. She sat there with the receiver in her hand for a full minute. Then she put it down and called Ben for the 3rd time that day. "Move the story up. I want it online by 8 tomorrow morning," she said, "and add a final quote from me at the end. I'll give it to you now." "Go ahead," Ben said. "My client is confident that the evidence will fully support her claims and that the truth will ultimately speak for itself. We believe in the integrity of the facts and welcome a full review." She could hear him typing. "That's it," she said. Not one word more. After she hung up, she sat in her quiet home office for 3 minutes, not to cry, not to second guess, but just to acknowledge, for herself, that the wheels she'd set in motion could not be stopped, and that she had done it knowing exactly what it would cost, and she had no regrets at all. None. Leo did not post his tell-all video at 4 o'clock. Isabel found out at 3:58 when Ben sent her a short text that just said, "He blinked. No video, no angry post." His PR person told the press it was cancelled due to a personal matter. She read the text, put her phone face down, and went back to the email she'd been writing. She wasn't surprised. A man who falls apart in a private phone call doesn't magically grow a spine 90 minutes later for a public audience. What she felt wasn't relief, not really. It was the unique calm that comes from predicting a weakness correctly. From knowing the person you're fighting so well, you can pinpoint the exact moment their courage will fail. She had known Leo Sterling for 8 years. 8 years of watching how he acted under stress, how he faked confidence when he felt insecure, how he lashed out with anger when he was scared, and hid behind his charm when the anger failed. She had studied him like you study a language, not on purpose, but just by listening, day after day, until you understand the grammar of a person better than they understand it themselves. That knowledge wasn't a gift. It was simply the price she paid for 7 years of paying close attention. At 4:15, her sister knocked and walked in. The PI's forensic team finished their initial review of all the bank records, she said. They want an emergency meeting, tonight. They said the situation is, and I'm quoting, dramatically more serious than we first believed. Isabel looked up. How much more serious? Her sister hesitated, which she never did. That pause told Isabel more than her next words. They think the Belford account is just a hub for a larger network. Multiple accounts, different countries. She paused again. They also found a connection to a fraudulent loan application he submitted to a commercial bank for a new property. Isabel put her pen down. Leo was borrowing money against assets he didn't even have. That's what it looks like, yes. She was silent for a long moment. She thought about the sheer weight of it, about a man who hadn't just stolen her ideas. He had built an entire architecture of fraud around the reputation her work created for him. He borrowed millions against a valuation built on her designs, and used that money for what? She didn't know yet, but she was about to find out. Set the meeting for 7, she said. In here. And bring Diana. Arthur nodded and left. Charlotte stood up and walked to the window. Below, the city was shifting into its late afternoon rhythm, a view she'd known since her father brought her here after school, letting her do homework in the corner while he finished his day. She just loved this building back then. Loved the feeling of being inside, something serious, something real, surrounded by people building things that were meant to last. She once thought that's what she was doing with Ethan, building something permanent. The thought came and went without breaking her. That was the difference now. The thoughts could still arrive, but they no longer had the power to stop her. Her phone buzzed. It was Priya. Victoria Prescott is trying to get through the main switchboard. She's called 4 times in the last 40 minutes. Do you want me to keep redirecting her? Charlotte typed back, yes. Log the times and the number she calls from. Send the log to Diana. Then she sat down and worked until 7 o'clock. The meeting that night lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. The forensic accounting team presented their findings. They were led by a sharp-faced director named Helen Chu, who had testified in 3 federal fraud cases. Her reputation alone could make guilty people nervous. They described the ugly truth with clinical precision. The Belford capital transfers were confirmed, 14 of them, just as Jessica's photos suggested, spanning 22 months. Combined value, $31.4 million. The money moved from Prescott Architecture's accounts through Belford Capital and into 2 more shell companies, one in the Caymans, one in Luxembourg. It finally landed in a private account that Helen's team traced, with high confidence, to a holding structure controlled by Ethan Prescott himself. That was just the first piece. The second was the lending fraud. Over 4 years, Prescott Architecture submitted false project valuation reports to 3 different commercial lenders to get lines of credit. Those reports were certified by an external assessor, the same Roy Callahan whose name was on Belford Capital. The valuations were inflated, in Helen Chu's opinion, by 60 to 80%, some projects. This was done to get loans the company's real performance could never justify. Total fraudulent lending was around $18 million. Diana sat across from Charlotte, filling a legal pad with notes since the meeting began. By the time Helen finished, the pad was almost full. Combined exposure, Diana said, not looking up. Financial fraud, lending fraud, IP theft. We could be looking at federal and state charges. Is there a RICO implication here? Helen Chu tilted her head. Potentially, if the third-party involvement constitutes an ongoing criminal enterprise. That's for prosecutors to decide, not accountants. But the pieces are there. Charlotte had been silent for 90 minutes. Now she spoke. How long has this been going on? She asked. Helen Chu looked at her. The earliest transfer we can confirm is 26 months ago. But the lending fraud started 4 years ago, right when Prescott Architecture's public profile began to rise. She paused. That raised the awards. The recognition, the interest from Wellington Holdings, that's what made the lending fraud possible. Without that reputation, no lender would have extended that much credit. The room fell silent. Charlotte looked at Diana. The reputation was built on my stolen designs, Diana said, speaking the truth into the room to make it real. Yes, Charlotte said, it was. Helen Chu looked between them. Mrs. Wellington, I need to ask you something directly. Your answer affects our recommendations moving forward. She waited for Charlotte to nod. Were you aware, at any point during your marriage, that any of these financial activities were happening? No, Charlotte said. I knew he stole my designs. I never knew about the money. And the corporate accounts, did you have any access or signing authority? Nah. My name is nowhere in Prescott Architecture's corporate structure. Helen Chu nodded, making a note. I ask because your complete separation from his finances is key to protecting you. It means when the authorities investigate, and Ms. Marsh. I assume you're making that call first thing tomorrow morning, Diana confirmed. Then, Ms. Wellington's status as the victim of the IP fraud, combined with her financial separation from the company, positions her as a cooperating party, not a subject of the investigation. Helen paused. That is very important. That has to be established from the very first contact. Charlotte let that sink in. She looked at the table, at the folders and printouts, the cold, damning math of what Ethan had built on the wreckage of her work. She felt something between anger and grief, the feeling of finally seeing the true scale of a disaster that was always too big to see at once. He used my work, she said, to build the credibility to steal from banks. Nobody in the room had a response for that. The meeting ended at 9:42. Helen Chu and her team packed up and left with the brisk urgency of people carrying evidence. Diana stayed. She and Charlotte sat across from each other in the quiet conference room. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. How are you? Diana finally asked. It wasn't just a formality. It was a real question from a woman who'd been Charlotte Wellington's lawyer for 9 years, and had just seen her endure the meeting of her life without even flinching. Charlotte considered how to answer. I feel like someone told me the house I thought was on fire was actually a different, bigger fire, she said. It's still burning, but it's larger than I knew. And it started a long time ago. I'm only just now seeing all of it. Diana nodded. What do you need? I need Ethan to know before tomorrow morning that this is about more than just the lawsuit. I want him to have tonight to understand the full scope of what he is facing. Charlotte looked directly at her, not to give him a chance to run, but because I want him to know that I know everything, all of it. I want him to spend tonight with that knowledge. Diana was quiet for a second. I can have his attorney notified of our additional findings tonight, professionally, through the proper channels, in a way that makes it clear federal involvement is coming. Do it, Charlotte said. Diana left. Arthur appeared as he always did, materializing where he was needed. He handed Charlotte her coat and bag and rode down with her in the elevator. Arthur, she said as they descended, did you know, back when I was married to him, did you ever suspect the financial crimes? Arthur was silent for a moment, and the silence was its own answer. I suspected, he said carefully, that Mr. Prescott was not what he appeared to be. I didn't have specific knowledge. He paused. I also chose, on several occasions, not to look for information you hadn't asked me to find. I have questioned that choice. Charlotte looked at him. Don't, she said. You respected my decisions, even when they were wrong. That's not something to regret. Arthur S.'s expression shifted towards something close to emotion, which for him was like anyone else breaking down in tears. You are very much like your father, he said. In the ways that count. The elevator doors opened. Charlotte walked through the lobby and out into the cool night air. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the city surround her, its noise, its scale, its absolute indifference to her story. And she breathed. She went home. She didn't sleep well, but she did sleep. And in the morning she was at her desk by 7:15, and the Wellington holding statement went out at 8 o'clock precisely. And by 8:30 a.m. her phone was buzzing with a fury that confirmed the digital lockdown had hit its mark. At 8:51 her lawyer Safathia called. TechCrunch is leading with it, she said. They ignored the affair angle. The headline is, Verdant Futures founder Clara Vance locks CEO husband out of his own company over stolen tech. A beat of silence, and Clara could almost hear the smile in Sophia's voice. Clara, it's a firestorm. Every tech blog has picked it up. Social media is, it's a lot. What's the reaction? She asked. Overwhelmingly on your side, Sophia said. The pregnancy, the stolen algorithms, the betrayal. People are getting it. The human element is breaking through the noise. Another pause. Ava's publicist released a statement an hour ago calling the claims a stunt by a jealous wife. It's going nowhere. Clara let herself feel a flicker of satisfaction, just one. Make sure our comms team is monitoring, not replying. We don't need to respond to her. The facts will. Already on it, Sophia said. At 9:17, Sophia called back. Liam's attorney called me at sunrise, she said, 2 hours before we even went live. Sophia's voice held a note Clara recognized as a mix of professional pride and sheer disbelief. He was asking for terms. Clara put down her cup of tea. Terms. Full restoration of your intellectual property rights, transfer of all patents related to the green algorithms back to you, and the complete dissolution of the shell corporation he used. Full cooperation with a forensic audit. Sophia paused, and he made one personal request which his lawyer delivered verbatim. What request? He wants to speak with you. One conversation, in person, before any criminal charges are formally filed. Clara glanced at the dark screen of her laptop, at her own faint reflection. Why? His lawyer was cagey. But my read is he needs to tell you something he's not willing to put in writing. Clara considered this. She remembered what Sophia had warned her the night before. That cornered people do desperate things, and she wondered why Liam would demand a face-to-face meeting instead of hiding behind his lawyers. And she thought about the broken sound of his voice on the voicemail he'd left yesterday when he'd said, I ruined everything, and she had simply deleted it. Tell his attorney the meeting can happen at 11 a.m. today, she said, here at my office. Marco will be present. The entire conversation will be recorded with Liam's full knowledge and consent. If he agrees to that, I'll see him. Sophia passed it on. The reply came in under 5 minutes, agreed. At 10:45, Marco buzzed the intercom. He's here, Marco said. He's 15 minutes early, Clara noted. Yes, Marco replied. He's been in the lobby for the last 12 minutes. Clara looked up from her desk. How does he look? Marco weighed the question with his usual gravity. Like a man who hasn't slept, he said, and like a man who has made a final difficult decision. She nodded. Give me 5 minutes, then bring him in. She used those 5 minutes to do something she had avoided for the last 48 hours. She opened her desk drawer and took out an ultrasound photo. It was small, tucked in a folder, a grainy image showing the tiny life they had planned for together. She had been happy that day. She could say that with total honesty. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. She looked at the photo for 30 seconds. She saw it for what it was. Not a weapon, not a memory. just a record of a hope that had been real before it became something else. Then she placed it back in the folder and shut the drawer. When Liam walked into the conference room, Clara was already seated. Marco stood by the door. A small audio recorder sat on the table between them. Its red light was a steady, silent witness. Liam sat down. He looked just as Marco had described. Stripped of sleep, stripped of the easygoing confidence that was usually his best defence. He looked, that Clara thought with a feeling she refused to call pity, like himself. Like the actual man who existed beneath the layers of performance. "I won't waste your time with apologies," he said. "I know they're worthless to you right now." "They are," Clara agreed. "I need to tell you something that the lawyers don't know." He put his hands flat on the table, the plan to sell your algorithms to Apex Innovations. "It wasn't my idea, it was your brother's." The air in the room went thin. Clara's expression didn't flicker, but inside her everything went perfectly still, the way the world does, seconds before the ground begins to shake. "Daniel?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He approached me 6 months ago. He gave me everything I needed to get past your security, to know which projects were most valuable." Liam's jaw was clenched. "I never asked why he hated you so much. I didn't want to know. I just wanted the money." He stopped, looking at his hands, but the information was too perfect, too personal. He knew things only family would know. "Someone inside your own life was using me to destroy you." Clara looked at Marco. Marco's face was unreadable, his eyes sharp, telling her he understood. This was no longer just business. 3 weeks ago, when I started realizing this could all blow up, he told me as insurance, a way of making sure I kept my mouth shut. He said that if I ever turned against him, he would destroy you along with me. Liam looked at her, his eyes hollow. "I think that's why he isn't worried about an investigation. He thinks he has you trapped." Clara kept her breathing even. Her face was a mask of calm, but inside, her entire strategy had just been blown apart by a complication she never could have imagined. "Does Daniel know you're here?" she asked. "No. Does your lawyer know you're telling me this?" "No. Liam." She leaned forward slightly. "If what you're saying is true, you've just handed me a conspiracy that is infinitely more damaging than stolen data. Do you understand what you've done?" "Yes," he said. "Why?" He met her gaze for a long moment, and in the quiet before he spoke, Clara saw something raw in his face. Not regret, not love, not even simple guilt. It was the expression of a man who had finally exhausted the energy it takes to pretend to be someone you're not. "Because you were right," he said, "about all of it. And because no matter what happens to me, I won't let the thing that ruins you be something I could have prevented." Clara sat with that. She looked at this man who had wounded her so deeply, who had taken the things she'd created and sold them, who was the father of her child. She saw all of it, the whole tangled disaster, and made a decision. "Marco," she said, "get Sophia on a secure line and get our head of cybersecurity." She stood. "We need to expand the scope of this investigation immediately." She looked at Liam. "Stay here. Don't make any calls. Don't contact Daniel. Don't contact your lawyer until Sophia has had a chance to speak with him directly." She paused. "If what you told me is true, and if it can be verified, it changes your legal position. Not completely, but significantly." Liam simply nodded. She walked to the door. Then she stopped, because something had to be said, and if she left it unsaid, it would stay lodged inside her, like a shard of glass. "The algorithms," she said, not turning around. "The Helios project, the bioconcrete, the water reclamation system, all of them." She took a breath. "I made those because I loved the work, not to build a brand or beat a competitor. I made them because that work is the most honest part of who I am." She turned then, just slightly, her hand resting on her stomach. "You and my brother took that from me. You twisted it into a product, something dirty, just for money." She stopped. "I want you to understand that. Not as an accusation, but as a fact I need you to live with." She left the room. In the hallway, she pressed her back to the cool wall for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds to let her body absorb what her face would not show. And then she stood up straight, pulled out her phone, and called Sophia. Because her own brother had tried to burn down her world, and Clara had absolutely no intention of letting him succeed. She just kept talking. The name surfaced in Clara's mind before Jenna Reed even finished her second sentence. It was just before noon, the day after Marcus's confession, and Clara was sitting at her desk, with Simone on speakerphone and Jenna's initial report on the screen in front of her. Jenna was detailing the specific nature of the Mercer Innovations data that had been leaked to Leo Croft. Source code vulnerabilities, prototype schematics, server access logs, the exact weak point in the Arian Dynamics security audit. And as Jenna spoke, Clara was mapping the network of who could have known all of those things at once, who had access to every single one of those data points. And the answer didn't feel like a conclusion she'd reached, but like a fact she'd always known and just hadn't been willing to see. The name left her lips before she could stop it. David Vance. There was silence on the call. Then Simone, her voice very cautious. What makes you say that? The server logs, the prototype designs, the security audit data. Clara was on her feet without even realizing she'd stood up. All of that data lives in the Advanced Projects Division. David led the Arion project for over a year. He signed off on the security exceptions. He was the one who got that quiet warning from Marcus's legal team and chose not to report it. She was pacing now, and when I confronted him about it in the boardroom, he didn't even deny it. He confirmed it. He handed me a 60-page technical brief that was detailed in every single way except one. It said nothing about Leo Croft. Nothing about Stonegate Financial. Nothing about the money. She stopped cold. A man who is genuinely trying to help does not leave out the part that implicates him the most. Jenna Reed's voice cut through the speaker. If Vance was feeding Croft the data, the timing of his report is critical. He submitted it the morning after the lawsuit dropped. If he knew a federal investigation was coming, that document isn't a confession. It's a calculated move to control the story and protect himself. Clara looked up at Julian, who was now standing in her office doorway, hands folded, with the grim expression of a man hearing his own worst fears confirmed. Julian, she said, how long have you been worried about Vance? Julian was silent for a beat too long. 18 months, he said. And you never told me? You weren't running the company day to day yet, he said, his words carefully chosen for accuracy, not comfort. I had a gut feeling, but zero proof. And bringing a concern without hard evidence about a senior director to a principal who wasn't even in the building yet would have been reckless. It could have damaged your authority before you even started. He paused. I made a judgment call. I know, it wasn't perfect. Clara stared at him for a long moment. She understood his logic. She didn't quite forgive it yet, and Julian saw that in her eyes. And he accepted it without making excuses, which was the only response she would have respected. We can talk about this later, she finally said. Right now, what's our next move? Simone's voice came through the speaker, crisp and decisive in a way that Clara depended on. We take everything to the feds today. The Stonegate financial documents, Marcus's confession from yesterday's conversation, which we have recorded, and everything Jenna's team has dug up on the data breach. We absolutely do not confront Vance directly. We can't let him know we've figured it out. We let the investigators do their job. If we tip him off, Jenna added, we risk wiping the servers clean. He's been here long enough to know where all the digital skeletons are buried. Agreed, Clara said. Simone, make the call. She waited a beat. And Simone, do it now. I want this in motion before Vance has any idea the game has changed. The call ended. Clara stood by her window again. That same window? Her window, the one overlooking everything. And she let herself feel the full, bizarre weight of the last 3 days. She had walked out of her marriage with a single suitcase and a shattered sense of trust that she hadn't told anyone about, not even her lawyer. She had walked into this building and seized control of her family's 30-year legacy. She had killed a disastrous billion-dollar merger, filed a massive intellectual property lawsuit, exposed a $40 million corporate fraud. and was now in the process of uncovering a profound betrayal that reached deep inside the walls of the company her father built. She had done all of that in just 72 hours. She thought of her father, of his hand on her shoulder the last time they stood here together, telling her that the only thing worth building is something that will outlast you. She always thought he was talking about the business itself. She understood now that he had been talking about character, about who you are when nobody's watching and you have nothing to hide behind, and the easy choice is to become less than you know you can be. She hadn't become smaller, not even in the marriage, not in all the years of staying quiet while Marcus took credit for her life. She had not shrunk inside. She had been observing. She had been waiting. She was becoming the exact person this moment demanded. At 12:31, Simone called back. "I just got off the phone with the FBI's cybercrime unit," she said. "I spoke directly with a lead agent named Carter. She was already familiar with Leo Croft's name from another investigation. I can't get more detail on that, but she wants us to meet this afternoon, 4 o'clock. She's coming to Mercer Innovations." "Good," Clara said. "Clara, I need to prepare you for something." Simone's voice changed, taking on a tone Clara knew meant bad news was coming. "Agent Carter said their current file on Croft includes communication records, cell tower data, and encrypted message logs. She wouldn't give me names, but she implied one of the burner phones they tracked pings repeatedly from the Thorne family estate." Clara took a breath. "Eleanor, that's how I read it," Simone said. "I might be wrong. It could be Marcus. It could be nothing." "It's not nothing," Clara said, and the certainty in her voice wasn't anger. It wasn't even shock. It was the sound of the last ugly piece of a puzzle, clicking into place of something she had sensed for years, finally taking a solid shape in the story of her life. So Eleanor Thorne wasn't just the condescending mother-in-law with a glass of wine, mocking Clara's every move. She wasn't just trying to write Clara out of the family story. Eleanor was in on the scheme. She knew about Croft. She knew about Stonegate Financial. She was helping her son steal with one hand and methodically destroying Clara's reputation with the other, all while calling her some naive housewife, absolutely convinced she was untouchable. "Tell Agent Carter," Clara said, "that I'll be ready at 4 and that I'll have Julian Hale with me. I'll offer our full cooperation." She paused. "And tell her I have another name I'd like to add to her list besides Croft and Vance." Simone knew not to ask. "I'll let her know," she replied. The afternoon was a blur, the way time gets when everything happens at once. Clara used the hours to work with Jenna Reed's team, packaging the digital evidence into the clearest possible presentation for the FBI, every file time-stamped, cross-indexed, and every claim supported by its raw data. She worked with the intense focus of someone who knew that the line between justice and a cover-up is often just the quality of your evidence. At 2 o'clock, her assistant Maria knocked gently. "Miss Mercer?" Her voice was hesitant. "There's a woman here to see you. She says she doesn't have an appointment, but that it's personal. Her name is Sophie." Clara finished for her. Maria blinked. "Yes." Clara thought for a second. 3 days ago, she had watched this same woman standing in her living room, a ghost in her own home. 3 days wasn't a lot of time to find grace. But it had also taught her something about the difference between people who chose to hurt her and the ones who were just tools used by the same man. "Send her up," Clara said. "The small conference room, not the main one." Sophie arrived looking like someone who had been making a series of very hard choices and wasn't done yet. She sat across from Clara, her hands folded so tightly on the table, her knuckles were white, as if stillness was the only thing holding her together. "I saw the story break online," Sophie said. "I did too," Clara replied. "I wanted to let you know. I've already talked to my own lawyer." She looked Clara right in the eye, and Clara saw a flash of real courage, the rare kind that belongs to a woman who knows she's been made a fool of and is choosing to face the music instead of run from it. "I laid it all out for her, the documents, the call from Ethan, everything. My lawyer is getting a statement ready for the feds. She paused. I'm not going to protect him. Whatever he did, I won't be that person. Charlotte just watched her. She imagined being 26, pregnant, and realizing the man you were building a future with was just using you as a convenient cover story. How are you? Charlotte asked. And she genuinely wanted to know. Amid all the chaos, the question was real. Jessica's composure seemed to crack a little at the simple kindness of it, like when you brace for a blow and get a hug instead. I don't know, she said. Honestly, I'm just taking it one day at a time. Charlotte nodded. Your baby didn't have anything to do with this, she said. Whatever happens to Ethan, that child isn't responsible. I want you to know I'm going to make sure that any money recovered from this lawsuit doesn't interfere with his support obligations to you and your child. She watched Jessica's face. You should tell your attorney to expect that. Jessica just stared back at her, completely still. Why would you do that? Because it's the right thing to do, Charlotte said simply. And because I'm not interested in punishing people who weren't the ones who caused all this damage. After Jessica left, Charlotte sat by herself in the small conference room. She thought about the other versions of herself this whole disaster could have created. The version that would have fought for revenge above all else. The one who would have crumbled under the weight of the betrayal and 7 years of being made to feel small. The version who would have signed those papers, taken the hush money, and just disappeared. None of those versions were in this room. Agent Reyes arrived at 4 o'clock sharp, and she was exactly the person the moment required, calm, precise, with that unique stillness of someone who has heard 1,000 stories and knows how to find the truth in them. She came with a younger colleague, took the coffee, Priya offered without breaking focus, and looked at Charlotte with eyes that saw more than they revealed. Miss Wellington, she said, I appreciate you cooperating. I'll give you everything, Charlotte replied completely, and without holding anything back. The meeting lasted for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Charlotte answered every question they had. She gave them every single document. She told the story plainly, without adding drama or trying to soften the ugly parts. And when Agent Reyes's questions turned personal about the marriage, about when Charlotte found out about the stolen designs, about that Tuesday morning, she answered those with the same honesty. The truth was, the truth, no matter if it was professionally damaging or personally painful. At one point, Agent Reyes put down her pen and gave Charlotte a look that was almost, but not quite, unprofessional. Miss Wellington, she said, I need to understand this timeline. You knew about the stolen designs 4 years ago. Yes. And you didn't take any legal action then. No. Why not? Charlotte had been waiting for this question. She had asked it herself. Because I was still inside the marriage, she said, and I knew that trying to act from inside it, where my own credibility was tied to his, where my entire identity was tied to a name he controlled, would have been pointless. I would have been crushed. She paused. I waited until I was fully independent from him, until the power was finally in my hands, not his. Agent Reyes stared at her for a long moment. That's a significant amount of patience, she remarked. It's a significant amount of faith, Charlotte said, in the idea that the right moment will always come if you're willing to wait for it. The federal investigation moved quickly after that, the kind of speed you get when the documents are clean, the witnesses are cooperative, and the main suspect has already been on a watch list for 8 months for something else. That was the last detail Reyes shared. Roy Callahan had been under surveillance for a securities fraud case, and the documents Charlotte provided had connected 2 investigations that had been running side by side, never knowing they were chasing the same man. Gerald Patterson was put on administrative leave from Wellington Holdings the very next morning. Charlotte did it herself. She called him into her office at 8:15 and told him exactly what she knew and what was about to happen. And she watched his face scull through the stages of a man who knows he's been caught the denial, the quick attempt to spin the story, and then the quiet collapse when he realized the evidence was too strong. "I needed the money," he finally said, his voice stripped of all its usual confidence. "My son, the medical bills. I made a choice I can't undo." Charlotte looked at him. She didn't offer sympathy, but she didn't offer cruelty either. She had learned something this week about the line between accountability and revenge, and she had no interest in crossing it. "Your cooperation with the federal investigation will be the single most important factor in what happens to you next," she said. "I would advise you to talk to a lawyer this morning." She stood. He left. She sat back down at her desk and felt a profound exhaustion that didn't come from a lack of sleep, but from days of being on constant high alert. She was tired in a way that sleep couldn't really fix. But underneath that exhaustion was something else, something that felt a lot like freedom. Victoria Prescott was interviewed by federal investigators on a Thursday, 12 days after Charlotte had walked out of that mansion for good. The interview was private, but the news of it wasn't. These things always get out in the right circles, and Charlotte heard about it from Diana, who'd heard it from Agent Reyes, who only said that the interview had been productive and that new inquiries were now being made. 3 weeks after that, Ethan Prescott accepted a plea deal. The specifics weren't public, but Diana laid them out for Charlotte over the phone in her usual precise, calm manner. A full admission of stealing the intellectual property, full financial restitution to the banks, cooperation with the federal investigation into Callahan, and a prison sentence of 4 years, with a chance of parole in 2.5. Charlotte took it all in. When Diana finished, she was silent for a beat. "The designs," she asked, "are they officially returned to me?" "Effective on the date of the plea agreement," Diana said, "every single one. Full ownership, with damages calculated on the revenue they brought in." She paused. "Charlotte, the number is not small." "I know," Charlotte said. "Put the litigation damages into a separate fund. I want to discuss how we'll use it next week." She had known for a long time what she wanted to do with that money. She'd known since the morning she packed her boxes and walked out that door, thinking of all the women who couldn't leave. The ones with no car service waiting, no building on the 38th floor with their name on it. The women who were stuck in those rooms she'd been in, being told they were nothing, being pushed around, their contributions erased, and their silence bought, with the threat of what happens to women who speak up, who had nowhere to turn. The Wellington Foundation for Independent Living opened its first facility 4 months after the plea was finalised. It was a shelter, a resource centre, and a transitional housing programme, all staffed by people who understood that surviving something isn't the same as recovering from it. And it was funded completely by the damages recovered from the Prescott architecture litigation. Charlotte was there for the opening herself. She stood in the entrance of the building, she shook hands, and she accepted the thanks she was given. She had been through enough to know there's no honour in false modesty, and no health in taking credit that belongs to a moment instead of to you. She had done this Dodder model. She wouldn't pretend she hadn't felt it. David stood beside her, a constant presence. At one point he leaned in and murmured, "Your father would be proud." "I know," she whispered back, feeling it deep in her bones. It was a strange comfort, the presence of someone long gone, whose strength was now so woven into her own spirit you couldn't tell them apart. Liam was transferred to a federal prison on a grey Wednesday morning. Amelia ignored the news alerts. She had already processed what his downfall meant and what it didn't. She had no desire to watch the public spectacle. She took the call from her sister Chloe, said almost nothing, and simply moved on to the next meeting. Sophia Dubois was never criminally charged. There was proof she knew about Liam's scheme, but not enough to prove conspiracy a legal technicality that frustrated Chloe far more than Amelia. But Sophia faced another kind of justice. The civil suits came for her family's assets with surgical precision, dismantling the Dubois fortune piece by piece. The socialite status she had built her entire life upon simply crumbled into dust. Amelia heard the news from her lawyers, who were tracking every detail. She took it in with that same unnerving calm she'd shown for months. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was something deeper, a quiet sense of order being restored. It was the feeling of a world finally set right, after being upside down for so long you almost forgot what gravity felt like. 6 months after it all began, Amelia arrived at Vance Industries just after 7. She took the private elevator to the top floor, took her coffee from David, and sat down behind the desk that was her father's and was now hers. She opened the day's first encrypted file. On her desk sat a single, slim frame she'd placed there herself. It was the only personal item in the whole room. It wasn't the old photo, the one of her parents laughing in the garden, the one she'd quietly tucked away in a drawer. The old photo was still in the drawer where it belonged. It was a piece of history, and Amelia Vance didn't erase history. The picture in the frame was new. It showed her alone, standing at the vast window of this very office, her back to the camera, looking down at the sprawling city below. David had taken it quietly on her first day back, and simply left the print on her desk. She knew exactly what it meant the moment she saw it. It was a portrait of a woman who knew precisely where she was. An empire of patented technology, a federal investigation she had survived, a foundation in her father's name, and a company that would endure long after the man who tried to steal it was forgotten, a man who never grasped what he was trying to hold. For 7 years, Amelia Vance let them call her a nobody. They needed her to be small so they could feel powerful themselves. And she endured it all with a quiet intelligence, playing a long game that looked like submissions right up until the moment it didn't. She hadn't been shrinking. She had been focusing her power, and when she finally released it, nothing was left standing in her way. Amelia opened the next file and got to work. Because this was who she was. This was who she had always been. And no one would ever make her forget that again.